Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Phoenix Gaming. I'm your host, Nick Henning, and today we're going to talk some more about Ark Nova Strategy. I have been playing a fair amount of this game in recent memory, I guess in my recent life. I also, at the World Board Gaming Championships, recently placed second in this tournament for a tournament that I think had like 117 different players in it. I also placed second on the tiebreaker, so very, very nearly won that game, but not quite. And I think one of the reasons that I am performing pretty well in this game is that there's an aspect of interaction in this game that I think I have a pretty good sense of that I want to talk about today. So, I think one of the more common criticisms about Ark Nova is this idea of like, is there even enough interaction in this game? This is kind of the big, I think it's just a big multiplayer solitaire type thing. And, I'm not going to sit here and convince you that Ark Nova is a highly interactive game. It isn't, and I think that's actually part of the reason why it is appealing to so many people. But there is interaction in this game that you do need to pay attention to. I think there's essentially three primary points that you're looking at. It's how is the break occurring in this game? How are cards being drawn off of the public draw track? And are you racing for those conservation projects? Those are probably the three primary aspects of interaction that you're going to see in the game. And we are going to just focus today on one. We're going to talk about the break because the break is something that I think is more in your control than just about anything else. I think that all aspects of these interaction are more significant in a two-player game, which is why you look at all the highest rated people on BGG. They pretty much just play two-player games. I do think that these rules still apply to a four-player game. So we're going to talk about the break and how it works with the rest of the game. The break track in the game is your primary sense of what is the flow of this game looking like. It's different how far down the track you are at 2, 3, or 4 players, and that does make a difference in the 3 stages of this track that I think you need to consider. Stage 1 of this track is the track is so far away from being complete that it's irrelevant. Whether this track, right now, this looks like it's maybe a 3-player game or a 4-player game where it's moved 3 spaces along. It's so far away from the end that you don't really care about it, right? It's binary. Either the break has been triggered or it's not. We're far away now. This is the first stage of essentially, it's not my concern right now. The second kind of stage is it very possible that the break is going to be triggered before my next turn? This is really, really different looking in a 2-player game, a 3-player game, and a 4-player game. Technically, in a 4-player game, at the end of any one of your turns could be the next break. If the next player goes sponsors 5 for break, then the player after that goes sponsors 5 for break, and then the third player goes sponsors 5 for break. Anytime those sponsors cards actions are at the top of the track, or the top of people's action rows, it could be a concern. So let's start off by talking about 2-player. In 2-player, most commonly, is it possible for it to be triggered is I've done a card draw, which has moved the break marker twice. You've done a card draw, which has moved the break marker twice. And if you count there, 4 spaces from that 2 right there puts us 5 away from the end. 5 is generally the magic number for the break could come at any time because anybody who has a sponsor's action at 5 could choose to trigger it at that time. I use that as my rule of thumb in every single form of this game. If I am playing a 3 or 4-player game and I am 5 away, I take a quick look and see what do other people's sponsors' actions look like. If they're at the top of the tracks, it is quite possible that this is the last action I'm going to take before the break happens. It's certainly more complicated than that. You kind of want to anticipate if your opponents are going to be pushing the break or not pushing the break, if they're interested in pushing the break. And we'll talk about what aspects those are. Before kind of figuring out, but you're trying to guess, are they going to trigger the break? Are they interested in triggering the break? Am I interested in triggering the break? And one of the things that you need to consider is what makes a person interested in triggering the break before knowing how it's going to happen. Question number 1 about the break is cards. You have a card limit in this game that's quite stringent. It's 3 cards until you get that university that grabs you 5 cards. I think when people are first getting good at this game, they rush that 5-card university because it is good, but I don't think it's necessary if you have a really tight game plan. That being said, like there are a lot of times where you're going to have more than 3 cards, and the break being triggered at that point in time could be absolutely catastrophic for what it is that you're planning on doing. Having 6 cards in your hand and discarding 3 of them, if you're planning on using many of those cards in your hand, can be an absolute nightmare. Similarly, your opponents don't generally want to be discarding cards. You can anticipate that everybody's got maybe 1 or 2 garbage cards in their hand at any given time, but if their hand size is 3 or even 5 and they're holding 8 cards in their hand, it's really unlikely that they're interested in triggering the break at that point in time. So the time that you need to be most concerned about the break being triggered is actually when you yourself are taking the card's action. By taking the card's action, you're going to move the break marker 2 more spaces, and you're going to make yourself vulnerable to essentially getting forced to discard those cards. People are a lot more aggressive, I think, in a 2-player game because they say, oh, if I trigger the break right now, you're going to discard a bunch of cards. I don't think that's terribly a good strategy in a 4-player game because usually you're only punishing 1, maybe 2 players. And that's, in general, I'll someday talk about my multiplayer philosophy. I think a bad way to approach strategically how you are playing Ark Nova or really any game when you're just punishing 1 or 2 players in a multiplayer game. But either way, if you see like, hey, by taking the card's action, I'm going to advance the break to a certain point that someone very reasonably could end the round, and they don't have this issue of having overly many cards in their hand, you could really shoot yourself in the foot. So card management is probably, I think, the top reason that people are looking at whether they're going to trigger the round. There's some very like psychological, I don't want to lose my stuff that comes with cards. I think more so than these other 2 categories, which are arguably even more important. So category number 2 is income. Income can come in lots of different ways. Primarily, we're going to be talking about money income, but certainly any income that is like, your conservation rewards, placing the 2 markers or drawing a card off the top or anything that gives you those bonuses. But we'll primarily focus on money income. At the very, very beginning of the game, you have 5, 6, 7, or 8 income and you have $25. No one at this point in time is terribly incentivized to trigger the break because they aren't broke, right? When people are broke, their options become very, very limited. So when you see people having 10 or fewer dollars, it becomes, you're in the territory now where they might be saying to themselves, I'm interested in a break occurring because I don't have the money. And similarly for you, when you have 10 or fewer dollars, you are getting pretty close to that point where you're saying, I'm running out of cash to do the things that I want to do. So maybe I want to move towards end of break. There's certainly also a difference between having $10 and no bucks, right? When someone has $0 or $1, they basically have nearly half their actions roughly are not going to do what they want them to do. So depending on where their cards are in their action row, they may or may not be pushing for that break to be occurring more often. The third thing that we really care about in breaks, and it's arguably even the most important, is what the situation is with your association workers and where your association action is. Generally, the beginning of the game of Ark Nova is the most awkward because if you trigger your association card and then it slides all the way back up to the top, but we haven't gone to break yet, it can kind of just sit there and block things out, preventing you from essentially doing what you want to do. Okay, so these are the 3 things we're considering about if you don't have association workers, if you have no money, if you are not overly drawn on cards, you're not past your card limit, you really want the break to occur. If, on the other hand, you have money remaining, you have workers left in play, and your card limit is you have cards in your hand that are over the limit, you really don't want the break to be happening, right? And these things might be pretty obvious, but this is a point of interaction where it is really valuable to look around the table, particularly when you're in that kind of like the break track is in the middle of the break track area, to get a sense of when the next break thing is happening. And here's what I think to me is the core part of this video. For those of you who are Magic players, you're going to recognize this as like the who's the beatdown concept. But who is the breaker? Someone at every table, be it 2-player, 3-player, or 4-player, is someone who wants the break to happen faster than other players. That person is the person that generally has the fewest association workers. If you have just 1 association workers and your opponents have 2, Your ideal world is that the break happens every 5 turns, right? Essentially, that's a full cycle of cards. You want the break to be occurring so that your opponents do not get the advantage of multiple associations in between the times when you recall those workers. If, on the other hand, you have several workers, you are happy for that to be, expanded out further and further. I think the association workers example is the most salient and the most important part of this game. Tempo around association workers, I think, is probably the fundamental strategy in a lot of parts of this game. Income is a little bit more complicated because generally the person who has the most money on hand is the person that has the highest income as well. If you have money on hand, you don't need the break to happen. But that being said, if the break does happen, the person with the higher income gets the most money. So income actually kind of can be a very dangerous beast in that it feeds itself. High income begets higher money, begets more options, and means that you may or may not want the income or the break to occur, or may not need it to occur. The relationship, I would say, with income and causing the break, who is the person who's responsible for making the break, is if you and I have equal money on hand and you have higher income than I do, then I want you to trigger the break rather than me to trigger the break, because you're the one who is getting more rewards for the break occurring. So it basically becomes your responsibility to make sure that that happens. Now, I'm not talking about having an extra dollar or two. I'm talking about someone who has a significantly higher income than you, maybe 5 or 10 additional dollars along the way. And then, of course, I already mentioned the cards aspect. I don't think we need to belabor the point too much about when you do or don't want cards to be a concern there. But the person who is responsible for saying, hey, the break is impending, I want to make this happen, needs to be paying attention to what their worker situation is and what their income is. So let's dive into those things a little bit more. All right, your income comes from a few places, but primarily the very first thing you look at is what your victory point situation looks like, what your appeal situation looks like. And the more appeal you have, the more income you have. Now, at the beginning of this game, the appeal situation is very tight. The difference between having played an animal in the first lap or played a sponsor's card that gives you some smattering of appeal, anywhere between +3 and 6 or 8 appeal, all those things make a difference in terms of what your income is like, right? If you look at the bottom of the track and you are the first player, then the first 5 income you make is first 5 appeal you make is +5 to your income. If you were the 4th player, the first 2 appeal you make is just +2 to your income. And then after that, it's every 2 appeal gives you an additional income all the way up to 16. 16 is in a lot of ways, or 15 is in a lot of ways, kind of the magic number, because that is when the bonus for appeal sort of slides down. I guess 17 is really the magic number. It starts to really slide down. Once appeal is 1 for every 3 tickets or 1 for every 4 tickets, like up at 32 appeal, or even every 5 when we get into the 50s or something like that, then it becomes irrelevant. There's essentially no income difference between you having 45 appeal and me having 55 appeal, right? Between 45 and 55, we're looking at 2 additional income. However, the difference between you having 4 and me having 14, that's 9 to 14, is a $5 income difference, which starts to become significant in this game. So if your appeal is roughly on par with people at the beginning of the game, then you're fine. But if you're looking at those gaps there, it could be something that you want to consider. And trying to get at least a couple appeal before the first break of the game happens is pretty important, I think, in this game. The second part of income that I think is one of the bigger parts of income is the kiosk situation. So I think kiosks are one of the main reasons why you would choose to upgrade the build action. Upgrading build action is great for covering things on your map, and then also using your extra things to get kiosks and pavilions, which combo really well with your kiosks to give you essentially additional appeal and sit next to your kiosks to give you additional money along the way. I think a decent kiosk at the beginning of the game is going to give you 2, 3, or 4 bonus income. It's not going to make or break the bank, but having just 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of these, depending on your situation, in the early or early mid game can really put a distance between you and your opponents in terms of what your income situation looks like. Cards also obviously make a big difference. Things like federal grants is like one of the best things that you can get at the beginning of the game. Just plus $3 income during each break is going to add up a fair amount over the course of the game. And then conservation projects, every map has that $5 income, which to me is one of the most powerful of the choices you can take if you have the ability to take an early conservation in this game. So lots of different ways for people to kind of accrue income, but you'll have a good sense of what your income looks like compared to your opponents based on those couple key cards that they might have in play, your side entrance, your federal grants, etc., what the appeal situation looks like, how many kiosks folks have in play and how they're played out, and then maybe if they have that $5 income component there. A little harder to tell in real life what people's income looks like, but very, very easy to tell on Board Game Arena. So again, my philosophy on income is if we're both broke, then the person who has significantly more income is the person who is more interested in pushing towards the break. And if you're not that person, making it so that they have to get there is a little bit different. It does get more complicated when we talk about people having cash on hand. Some of the funnier games of this game that I've played, someone might have a ton of money on hand, actually so much money, $30, $40, but be struggling to have the cards to play it, or maybe they just have the tempo of the action cards are kind of out of sync for them. If you push the break really quickly and they go up to $60, $70, $80, and you go up to $30, that actually might work out more in your advantage because you are in desperate need of money and they have so much money that they might struggle to actually spend it, or at least spend it effectively before the end of the game. So if you find yourself in a position where you're low on cash and they are high on cash, even if their income is much higher than you, you're probably still benefited by really, really pushing the break situation. By doing things like taking the sponsors action to give you some dollars, which you might need if you're lower income anyway. So that's the income side of things, but let's go over to talk about the association worker side of things. Association worker actions are kind of, I think, the key tempo in this game, and managing them is a huge part. Primarily, you should be, in my opinion, using your X tokens to manage, accelerate your association workers in ways that benefit you the most. In a lot of ways, I think your first action plan from your starting hand should be asking yourself the question of, how am I getting my second association worker in this game? You cannot essentially by yourself, except for maybe in a 2-player game, guarantee that breaks are going to be a short period of time. It's possible that you play a kind of game where breaks do wind up constantly being a short period of time, but it's more likely that it's going to kind of ebb and flow based on the desires of the other players and what it is that they're doing and what cards they have in their hands. You want to be in a position where you can take a second association action really early in the game if possible. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, where do we get these guys from? Well, first of all, you can get them from cards. There's a couple full-throated cards. Those all generally require you to have something upgraded and sort of work towards them. I do really like full-throated, I think, more than the average competitive player. I think they kind of look down on those, but I do think they give you avenues for playing this game in a way that is not traditional, that I think is actually quite beneficial. So I think that having a game plan around them is nice, but it is very specific and it requires you to do the right amount of setup and have kind of the right circumstances to make them work. So instead, you're probably looking at getting your first worker from one of the other, well, I've put 3 here, but there's actually 4. Hold on. All right, we're getting cluttered here with the pictures, but they're all here now. So there's 4 primary ways of getting workers at the beginning of the game if we're not talking about the cards, because again, those require specific setup. At the top here, we have the reputation track. It is really, really hard to get to 8 reputation before one of these other components are going to happen. You can on certain maps that get those reputation bonuses, things like sponsors that give you additional reputation. Maybe if you flip animals, that gives you another kind of reputation along the way. I have seen people get up to 8 reputation before the end of the first break. It is possible, but it really requires kind of like a nuts draw. If you see in your hand a lot of different reputation options, ask yourself if rushing to 8 reputation is an option, because if you can, that is a really, really powerful start that doesn't require you to do one of these other things that wants a little bit more work along the way. The second one I want to talk about is this here. It is the conservation project. So I mentioned that the $5 income is really good, and I do love opening the $5 income. I also like having the 2 square income, right? Because that's essentially 4 income, but it also reduces the needs of your build actions. So I quite like that one as well. Drawing a card is also okay, or snapping a card is also okay, but I think more situational than those other two. But the thing is that the first association action that I end up taking, and like, I don't know, 3/4 of my games or something like that, is to get a second worker. So that second worker action off of your conservation project is one of the key things. And so if you look at your opening hand, you say, ooh, I can make that conservation project happen in the second break cycle, get my second worker immediately. Then on the second break cycle, you already have a second worker who is doing that work for you. Really, really, really key strategy in the game. And I think is also one of the reasons why the breeding programs, bird breeding programs, primate breeding programs, and so on and so forth are one of the strongest cards you can start with at the beginning of the game. Because if you can set up your first break in such a way that you are preparing for sliding your association action to the top of the list, making sure that you have the animal with the appropriate zoo, and then you start the second break, jam that action, jam the breeding program out there, and get another association worker. Other players, even if they're trying to rush the break, might not have the opportunity to trigger it by the time that you actually slide association up to 3 or 4. Grab yourself another partner zoo or a university along the way, which is a really nice basic. I think that's like strategy 101. That's like the fundamental, what I'm going to do most of the time openings to this game. Really powerful. If you can't do that, if you can't make a conservation project happen, another common way of making it happen, which you can decide from the beginning of the game, is I'm going to do it by getting my third partner zoo. And generally, if you're doing it to get your third partner zoo, your plan is to get a partner zoo in the first break, get a partner zoo in the second break, flip association with that, and then get a partner zoo on the third break as well, which will then give you your additional worker that you now need to have that second worker in play. That line of play is fine. It requires you to be very, very focused, very narrow in what it is that you're doing with your association actions. And oftentimes you kind of have like what I would call like dead or wasted action spaces, because the association action only needs to be at 3, but you're likely triggering it at 4 or 5 to just take an association worker 3 action, which is not ideal. In a situation where this is your game plan, your job at the beginning of the game is to push the break as much as possible. It is very, very likely that you're just going to sponsors for $5 and like push towards the end of that break as fast as you can, because your plan is to essentially march up the petting zoo track here. We talked about conservation projects and how they can allow you to get that conservation reward to get a worker. But the other thing they can do is give you 2 CP, or I'll probably call them victory points or whatever, 2 green victory points. 2 green victory points gets you to that decision space of, do you want an association worker or do you want to flip a card? This is a really tough decision. Flipping a card is probably better for your long-term game plan. There's only 4 card flips in the game. You'll never get more. And there's plenty of games where you might not even get both of the card flips from your petting zoo or from university. So if you are foregoing the card flip at Conservation Space 2, you might be playing only a 2 card flip game. People ask me a bunch. I posted on the last video about like, how do you even play with 3 card flips? It's very viable. It's viable to play this game with 2 card flips, but it's a pretty big sacrifice, I think, to go to that 2 conservation points and elect to choose the worker over flipping a card. Here are situations where I think you should take the worker over flipping the card, or at the very least consider it. One is there a reason, like if you got the 2 CP from conservation action, is there a reason why you really need the income more so than just taking the worker from the first conservation action? And the answer might be it's very significant, right? Like it might be a very big deal. In that case, you might want to consider getting a worker if you don't have another way of quickly getting up the tracks, the reputation track or whatever, to get another worker. Like you need to get a second worker at some point in time before the mid game, essentially. So that's one reason. Another reason might be if you are playing a board that rewards having 4 full workers. It's 2 CP for having your 4th worker. then it's maybe a fair consideration earlier in the game to take this as the reward instead of the card flip, hoping to essentially push towards the end of the game sooner rather than later. I think that's a place where you could consider it more. If you're playing something like Silver Lake, which has no rewards for having 4 workers, it feels a little bit worse to do this. And then the other one is, how badly do you need this card flip? What does it do for you right now? Do you need to flip builds so that you can increase your income? Do you need to be flipping animals so that you can increase your reputation? Do you have a bunch of sponsors cards that need to be upgraded here? Like, you need to realize what it is that you're giving up by not flipping a card and choosing the association worker there. The last thing, and I haven't talked about this yet because I've primarily talked about getting into 2 conservation by taking a conservation project, but there are animals and sponsor cards that give you CP, and it is possible if you have something like guided school tours and not a jaguar, but the other one, a leopard, that gives you 1 CP for the sponsor and 1 CP for the animal, and you might get to 2 CP pretty quickly, and maybe even in the first lap, and people are dilly-dallying about pushing the brake because they've been playing their own sponsor cards. That could be a really spicy start to have a second worker before the first break even happens. You can do some really powerful stuff with that and catch your opponents unaware, which I think is very worth noting along the way. So understanding where you get your association worker from or not, right? Or realizing that I'm not getting an association worker for a while because I'm really focusing on a university strategy and I don't have conservation projects that work for my starting hand. If that's the case, then again, you are the breaker, right? If you can't get your worker, someone else at the table has a game plan that does get another worker in play. And it's not that you need to, remember I kind of posited before, like, oh, if I get a worker really quickly and then it slides up to space 3 and they take it, that doesn't suddenly mean that you're not interested in pushing the brake anymore, because what you don't want is your association action to sit at the top of your track while your opponents continually take actions sliding their association worker up over the course of the game. As long as essentially every round cycle you benefit equally from your association worker sliding up, you are okay. One of the weirdest situations is that you actually can get away with 1 worker if you have essentially the conservation nuts, meaning that like you can fill a conservation project and then fill another conservation project and fill another conservation project, and you know that you're just going to chain conservation projects together. That might happen in a situation where you've got like migration recording and a bunch of animals to release or something like that, or a breeding program that pairs with it. You could choose, right, if you know that you're going to do that kind of string, to not take a second worker, because re-triggering association and sliding it to the bottom when it's in slot 3 or 4, when in fact you actually want it to go up to slot 5, means that you've got 5 cards between here and there. So you're kind of hoping that naturally through the course of the game cycle, your association action card is essentially sliding up. It's having as many boosts to its power as your opponents are. But the problem you get into is when your card is up there and it is stuck, or if you have to X out your association action. There are cards that are worth Xing out, and association action, if it's a card that you're Xing out, by Xing out I mean, sliding it to 1 and taking an X for it, which is a totally valid action. That feels really bad to do it with association because the action is so deeply important. To summarize, if you are thinking about how can I interact more powerfully with my opponents in Ark Nova and kind of control the pace of the game a little bit more, you need to be thinking about this question of, am I the breaker? Are you the person that wants the round to end quickly? Do you want the rounds to go on for a longer period of time? I didn't mention all the things that I would consider in this, so I'll try to kind of run through a few others that I'll consider. But one is, what's your card situation? Do you have too many cards in your hand, cards that need to go, cards that don't need to go? Are they good cards? Are they bad cards? What's your opponent's situation? Can you force them to discard some stuff and maybe put them in an agonizing situation? Generally, you're a little bit more protected by this if you have the 5-card draw university or 5-card hand size university, and vice versa. Same is true for your opponents. The other thing I did not mention about cards is sponsors, right? If you have a bunch of sponsors in your hand, you have options about not being the breaker. Like, you might want sponsors to keep going up to the top. In this game that I played at the World Board Gaming Championships, I did not have a lot of workers, but I did have a lot of sponsor cards because I was playing Hollywood. which means that I was okay with the rounds going a little bit longer, because by sliding my sponsors to the top and getting to take those sponsors actions over and over again, my opponents, who were, roughly equivalent to me on income at the beginning of the game, were not necessarily getting as much parity over me as they might if I did not have those sponsors cards to play. So your cards, what cards you have, what cards can be played, are a really big deal. But if what you're doing to sort of keep the cards in your hand is like taking, build 1, build 2 actions to prolong the round, like that's probably a problem. The income situation cares a lot more about what your cash on hand is and what it is versus your opponent's cash on hand. Generally, if they benefit more by going to the break because their income is more powerful than your income, then you're maybe interested in putting them in a position where they need to force the income there. You can tell that the game wants to reward people to break because it gives you an X for doing so. Sometimes it is totally worth it if you know your opponent is going to force the break on their turn anyway, to do it for that X alone, especially if you're in desperate need of X's. But that being said, I have a theory that I can't support through any real evidence, that the person who breaks the game the most tends to be the person who loses. The third is, I think, the most important question. What is your association worker situation? If we're all sitting here with one worker and our association is just sitting at the top of our tracks, or we're Xing out our associations, so be it. That's not a big deal. You, in this case, don't care about the association worker tempo so much as your relative association worker tempo to your opponents. If they have 2 or 3 workers and you are still on 1, then you want your association card slides to be on parity with them by taking, the higher actions, your universities and your conservation projects, while they are, essentially having the same number of slides going back and forth. And if you can keep it down to a 5-turn break cycle, then they're not really going to get any advantage on you. If, the first thing you do is association for 5, and then 5 turns later, the break has happened, your association card's back up top, then you're okay with that. But if that is not the case, you should consider being the breaker. So what does it mean to be the breaker? What are you considering? There's sort of 2 main ways that you need to think about forcing or delaying the break. If you are trying to delay the break because you are not the breaker, you are the person who has more association workers, you have more cash on hand, you have more sponsors in your hand that you want to play, considering doing things like Xing out actions that generate breakpoints is really important. I do not see people X out their cards action, I think, quite enough in this game. Xing out cards feels bad because drawing cards is good. Cards are really powerful. It's how you win the game. But if you already are at essentially a level of cards that you are going to be discarding when the break comes, or kind of close to discarding when the break comes, just drawing more cards just increases your options. Don't get me wrong, that is good, but maybe those 2 points on the break track actually really stymie your opponent from trying to rush the break. So suppose this situation in a 2-player game. I have 2 or 3 association workers and you just have 1. If I take the cards action and you take the cards action, then anytime, essentially willy-nilly, you could take the sponsors action at 5 to end the round. And I might not want that to happen. By Xing out the cards action, sliding it to the bottom, I now have put myself in a situation where you have to do a lot more to end the round. You have to do cards and sponsors for 5 with 2 X's, or cards and then sponsors and then cards again, which requires the cards to slide up, or you're just taking a really crappy action to do it. By me not doing those 2 points in a 2-player game for cards, it can make a really big difference. You have less power over that in a 4-player game, but this fundamental thing is still true. What people want to be doing is playing sponsors cards out of their hand. Taking $5 or even $10 is not generally where you want to be in comparison to playing cards. So people tend to only do that when they need to force the break or when they don't have sponsors cards in their hands. Speaking of, let's talk about Xing out sponsors. I can't tell you how many people I see jam sponsors for $5 so that they can go to the end of the break and get an X. And they say, well, it's better than just Xing out the sponsors. And that's not necessarily true. If going to break is better for your opponent than it is for you, it actually could be a situation where just taking the X on sponsors and foregoing the $5 might actually be the right call. So something to consider as you're moving through. Sponsors is the card that it kind of depends on your card draws that you might be pushing to the bottom of the track as often as possible. And of course, I've talked about this the whole time, but don't forget that you can just sponsor for break, right? $5 and move the break track 5 is a very, very quick way of getting there. Generally, I think that it is better to X out appropriate cards and take one big sponsors action than doing something like sponsoring for 2 or 3. Don't go to your games and sponsor for 2 or sponsor for 2 or 3, which does not in itself trigger a break and say, oh, Nick was telling me to push the break. You want those break bumps to be enough. So sliding sponsors to the top of your track by Xing out cards that are higher that you're unable to use is a ultimately more efficient way than doing sponsors for $3 and break, sponsors for $2 and break along the way. I hope this helped you think about some things. I ended up talking a lot longer about this than I thought, so hopefully it made some sense. And you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, like, what do you think? What are your considerations when you're talking about break? Is there anything else that I'm missing in terms of like income, association, and cards that you think are really important to consider in this process? But thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you soon. Bye.